All right, let's talk about morality. All right, it can be somewhat of a disturbing topic sometimes, but I want to start out with an example. Test to see where you all are. All right, let's say that I were to bring no children in the class. I want to say for anybody recording, no children are in the class right now, so I'm not being too sick. Let's say I bring a newborn baby up here at the front of the class, and I chop that little baby to bits. Have I done anything wrong?
Yes.
Yes. Why? Why do you think it's wrong?
Because God said, "Thou shalt not kill."
God says thou shalt. Okay, but now you're talking to a non-Christian. Let's say that I'm out there in the world, all right, and I'm doing my whole apologetic thing, and I have a skeptic I'm talking to. If I'm talking to the skeptic, I can't say it's wrong because it says so in the Bible.
But that's God's thing, and
Man's law.
it's a law anyway in the United States. I mean, it's a world law.
Well, is that what makes it wrong? Let's say that there's a country out there that says it's okay. I'll give you an example historically. All right. Well, I was thinking more. There have been historically. I don't know if they still practice this, and if they don't, I apologize for even bringing it up. But there have been some Eskimo cultures, for example, and other cultures in the brutal North, where survival is very, very difficult, that have on occasion found it morally acceptable to kill babies to control population. Because the fact of the matter is, it's darn near impossible. You get too many mouths to feed, and you can't. The other mouths aren't going to have enough food and everything to go around. They can't survive. So let's assume that there's some culture out there that says it's okay to kill babies, in those circumstances. Does that make it right? Is it still? Does that all of a sudden resolve it in your mind to make it okay? No. And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. That's the difficult thing that we need to confront. Is lots of times when people think about these topics, we say it's wrong. Although maybe we have a hard time articulating why it's wrong, but we know just because some legislature somewhere may pass a law to say it's okay doesn't make it okay. Our laws don't define our morality. We know that deep down. To give you an example, there was a lot of people disagree, all right, at least intellectually, is they will come up and say all morality is relative. And what that means is there is no universal moral law. We all decide for ourselves what's moral and what's not. Somebody once raised this objection to Ravi Zacharias in one of his speeches, after one of his presentations, actually came up and talked to him, and he said that all morality is relative, we all decide what morality is, and we'll talk about these in more detail in a minute so you understand what I'm talking about. But and Ravi Zacharias gave him the baby example, and said, well, if I were to bring a newborn baby up here and chop it up to bits, would I have done anything wrong? And the student, who was a college student, stopped and thought about it for a minute, and he said, I wouldn't like it, but I could not say that it was wrong, because he insists that everybody defines their own morality. And as Ravi Zacharias points out, but what was the first thing you said? I wouldn't like it. That should cause some alarm bells in your head. Why don't you like it? Why don't you like it? That's the question we need to answer. And he also said the counterexample, and he would never do this, but he said one thing you could do is always, I could walk up, punch you in the face, and say, okay, would it be better that I punched you in the face, or is it better that I did not punch you in the face? Please let me know. The point is that all of us, when we feel that wrong is being done to us, we believe there is some kind of higher standard to be applied. Let me give you an example, using that punching thing that we just talked about. And some of you had mentioned...
Now we get into the golden rule.
Well, yeah. But the question is why? A lot of people reject the golden rule as far as being anything other than something that individuals may believe. I'm going to use the civil. Somebody here mentioned our laws, the civil laws that we create. I'm going to use that as an example to illustrate the point. And let's say that I walk up and I punch George in the face. I'm not really going to do it. Although if you want to act it out for people who don't hear the audio, we can do that and scare them. Maybe think I actually did it. But let's say I walk up and I punch George in the face. And George says, "Ow! What'd you do that for?" And I say, "What are you complaining about? I think I was perfectly morally justified to do it." Or let's talk legally now. I think I was perfectly legally justified to do that. And George says, no, you weren't. I did nothing to provoke you. You just walked up and punched me in the face. That was completely unjustified. And I say, sorry, George, I think I was completely legally justified. And George says, no, you weren't. I said, yes, I was. George said, no, you weren't. I said, yes, I was. And we go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth.
Let's go see Judge Judy.
There you go. So what we have here is we have my set of values in this circle. We have George's set of values in this circle. Now, I say in my set of values that punching George in the face was legally okay. I think that was legally permitted. George says in his legal values it was not. If this is all there is, which is what relativism says, all right, are George and I ever going to be able to resolve our dispute? No. But what we have is another set of values. We'll call it the law. You open up a law book, that's what I do for a living, all right, and you look to see what it says. And what happens is both George and I are subject to that law. We are supposed to be obeying that law as part of this American society. And so we look in that law book, open that up, and that says, Ken, you are wrong. George, you are right. All right? So now we have a method to resolve our dispute. Now, I may still think that I was legally justified in hitting George, but like it or not, I'm just wrong. I mean, sometimes that's the answer. You're just wrong. And that's why we have law books, because they help us resolve disputes like this. All right? Well, what the morality argument has to do with is, forget legal now, let's say morally justified. I say I was morally justified in hitting George. George says, no, you were not morally justified in hitting me. Is there a moral law that we both are subject to, just like there was a civil law that we both are subject to? Relativism says no. The point of the example that I gave you at the beginning about chopping up the baby or punching somebody in the face is a lot of people love to say that. They love to say, oh, there's no law above us. But when you really boil it down to it, when they're the ones that feel wronged, all of a sudden they change their tune. All right. Another classic example, I don't know if this story is actually true or not, was a student who wrote a huge research paper on how all morality is relative, all truth is relative, nothing really matters, we all make it up all on our own. And very well researched, very detailed thesis paper, a lot of hard work went into it. Professor gave him an F. So he walks into the professor's office and says, what on earth are you doing? Says, I look at all the work I put in. This is very hard. This is very well researched. You know, I've cited all these other scholars who agree with me. I met all of your criteria, and this isn't fair. At which point the professor says, "Welcome to the club. Now that I see you actually do accept objective morality, I'll give you an A for your paper." That's the point. When he was on the wrong end of it, all of a sudden he did believe there was some standard above him and the professor, which the professor should have followed. All right. That's what objective morality is all about. Very famous atheist named Bertrand Russell was in a debate one time, and he believed in relative morality. He doesn't believe there's objective morality. And I'm trying to remember who it was that he was in the debate with. I can't remember off the top of my head right now. But he was asked, well, how do you tell the difference between right and wrong? And he says, the same way I tell the difference between red and blue or red and green. He says, well, but you tell the difference between colors by seeing them. How do you tell the difference between moral questions? He says, how else? By feeling them. And again, Ravi Zacharias, I love to quote him. He says that he let him off the hook here, but he says, Ravi Zacharias says, if I was in the debate, I think the next question would have been, well, Mr. Russell, in some cultures they feel like eating or caring for their young. Other cultures feel like eating them. Do you have a preference? You know, because that's the point. Feeling can lead to all sorts of different things. The heart can be deceived. We hear that all the time. But when it all boils down to it, when we're the ones on the receiving end, all of us abide by or believe that there is some law that everybody else should be subscribing to.
Yeah, but it's also God's law. I mean, come on now.
Well, that's what we're going to talk about.
You have to be careful, though. He's talking about people who don't believe in God, so they won't believe in God's
well,
law.
yeah, I know that.
Well, and that, to be honest with you, this is where we get into intellectual integrity, honesty, whatever you want to call it. Many atheists, anybody ever heard of a guy named Nietzsche? Or Nietzsche? I'm going to misspell this.
There's a Z-C-H.
There's a Z-C-H-E, I think, something like that. Friedrich Nietzsche was a atheistic philosopher, and to his credit, he came to this conclusion. The conclusion he came to was, if God doesn't exist, there's no higher moral law. It's not there. And so you're left with a society of where everybody's just competing moral values, fighting survival of the fittest kind of thing, is essentially what he had to say. But I want to spell out the argument for you. So you see, what we call that higher moral law is called objective moral values. All right? Objective moral law or objective moral value is something that's higher that we're all subject to whether we want to admit it or not. Subjective is something that we all just decide on our own. Whatever you personally believe is your subjective moral belief. The question is there an objective law above you so that if you believe something, it could just be that you're wrong. I mean, if you believe that killing babies is okay, you may believe that honestly, but you're just wrong. Just like when I honestly believed I was okay to hit George, we looked at that law book, I was just wrong. And that's something you can test your beliefs against. So here's the argument. Number one, objective moral values only exist if God exists. That's your premise number one. Premise number two, objective moral values do exist. Therefore, remember this symbol means therefore, what's our conclusion?
God exists.
God exists. Exactly. That's the argument. That's the form. Now, what that means is, if these two premises are true, then the conclusion is true. So what you're going to get into when you talk to people about this, it's not so much the conclusion. You know, people have to concede, if they know the first thing about logic, they have to concede that this conclusion does come logically from these premises. The question is, are these premises true or not? Well, we already talked about premise number two, objective moral values do exist. There's all sorts of ways you can argue for that, but perhaps the best way to show that that's true is that's a necessary, what we call a necessary presupposition in life. Everybody believes, when the chips are down, everybody believes that objective moral values exist. Everybody believes it. And if you don't want to believe it, punch them in the face and see how they feel. No, I'm kidding. Don't really do that. You can present that argument to them, however. But when the chips are down, why do people try to deny it? Because nobody wants an objective law to apply to them. In other words, we all want the freedom to do whatever the heck we want to do. We don't want there to be some law above us that tells us what we want to do. But we do want there to be a law above you when you do something that's going to hurt me. All right? So that's why it's so popular for people to deny premise number two. But when it boils down to it, nobody really believes that objective moral values don't exist. And there's other ways to argue for it. You can point to.
Well, you say everybody. Well, you say maybe atheists don't.
But when it boils down to it, I guarantee you they do. And it's a matter of all the examples I've given you were.
But they don't believe God exists.
Well, that gets into premise one, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay. Premise two is just objective moral values exist. A lot of people try to come up with some source for objective morality while keeping God out of the picture. And we'll see in a minute. I'll touch on some of those. Why they inevitably always fail, okay? But that's the dilemma a lot of them have. And a lot of people, they come to the honest realization, well, wait a minute, I do think objective moral values exist. If I didn't think that, here's the problem. If objective moral values don't exist, everything's subjective, then literally man is the measure of all things. Because it's individual people is all it is, individual beliefs. Well, okay, then which man is going to determine morality? Is it going to be Mother Teresa, or is it going to be Genghis Khan? Is it going to be Hitler, or is it going to be Hugh Hefner? All of these people legitimately believe that what they were doing was right. But can we honestly sit here and say that what Hitler did, there was nothing wrong with what Hitler did? That we have no right, that's really what it boils down to. This is getting back to postmodernism. You hear this a lot. That we have no right to tell Hitler, you were wrong. Another, again, to show you how everybody believes it when the chips are down, another Ravi Zacharias example. This is a funny one. He was about to speak to a group of lawyers. Maybe this is why I find it so amusing. The president of the Bar Association said, so before he started speaking, who had sponsored this, somebody helped organize the whole event. So what, are you some kind of preacher? He said, well, yes, ma'am, that's what I do. And you're here to talk to lawyers? And he says, well, yeah, I don't really know why I was asked, but I was asked to come, so I came. And he says, well, you're in for quite a day then, I guess. And he says, well, why is that? Well, these are people who make their living with words, all right? These are professionals at, articulating words and manipulating words for what they want them to mean. And he says, well, thank you very much. I'll keep that in mind. When he goes up there to start his speech, the entire room is sitting there with their arms crossed, scowls. You should see a bunch of lawyers, This is what I look like during the day, by the way, when I'm working. They teach this scowl in law school.
I saw that when I was a teacher.
So he starts out,
I think they teach it in high school.
He says, ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you about what I was watching on CNN before I came in here today. I want to tell you about the top 3 stories that we're seeing on CNN. The first story, or the first bit of news they reported, was about a survey where, one of these salvation by survey things, as Ravi Zacharias calls it, where they go out on the street and they ask a bunch of questions to see what everybody thinks, and they tally up the numbers. And the first question they asked was, do words have any meaning, or does each person give words meaning themselves? Think about that question for just a second. The question was asked using words. Do words have any meaning? If the answer is no, what did the question mean? What did the question mean? The question itself assumes that words have meaning, but then asks people, do words have any meaning, or do we all just make up what they mean? Guess what the answer was? Words don't have any meaning. Everybody decides for themselves what they mean. This, by the way, was right after the very famous presidential deposition about, well, that depends what your definition of is. Do you all remember that one? You're all old enough. So, wasn't that long ago. Then the next question, which gets to the point that we have today, was, if does objective morality exist, or does everybody just decide what's moral on their own? And yet again, they ask, the microphone goes around, asks the question, and the end result is, there is no such thing as objective morality. Everybody just decides on their own morality. And then Ravi Zacharias turns to the audience and says, ladies and gentlemen, do you know what the third item on the news was that day? If Saddam Hussein does not stop playing his word games, we are going to start bombing him. When the chips are down, we all believe there are objective moral values. We don't want them to apply to us. So if somebody comes up and sticks a microphone in our face and says, does objective morality exist? We're going to say, no, I don't want, because if we start thinking, that means that I'm going to have to obey it. But we do want objective morality to apply to Saddam Hussein. All right? And his words have meaning because he's playing word games saying he doesn't have weapons of mass destruction. Well, that's a whole sore point, I know, as that turned out, but this was before we had gone in. Anyway, so that's the point. For premise number 2, that's probably...
If he had him, he had enough time to get rid of him.
For premise number 2, the most effective way to show people that objective morality exists, to show that when they're the ones being wronged, they accept this premise perfectly well. The only time they don't is when they don't want to obey some rule that somebody else wants to impose on them. So the question then becomes premise number 1, is that true? Objective moral values exist only if God exists. Well, I want to first explain to you what Christian philosophers say about why God explains morality, the existence of God explains morality. This is fun because we've talked about cosmology in this class, we've talked about astrophysics in this class, and now we're talking about philosophy. Look at that. You're all going to be like professional professors. You get a PhD after this. All right. So the question is, does this object of morality exist only if God exists? Well, the first thing, in order to prove that it only exists if God exists, I got to do 2 things. Number 1, I got to prove that the existence of God does explain objective morality. And number 2, I've got to explain that no other explanation meets the criteria. No other explanation is satisfactory.
Do the only part.
Yes, the only part. Which I will tell you, this is what we call an inductive reasoning in order to arrive at this premise. In other words, it's impossible to prove a negative. All right? You can, for example, some hard atheist may come up to you and say, I believe 100% that God does not exist. Well, that's impossible to ever prove that because you would have to have infinite knowledge. You'd have to be able to explore every single possibility, every single look at every single crater in the universe and rock and everything to find out if God exists or not. Let's give you an example it's easier to understand. Let's say that I do not believe that the green cheese goddess, or the green cheese, let's call her the green cheese frog. I do not believe that the green cheese frog exists, and I say that definitively. Could I ever prove that? How do I know that on some distant planet at the other end of the universe there's not a green cheese frog? I don't know that. I would have to be able to literally have infinite knowledge to do that. That's why it's impossible to ever prove that something is false, does not exist, unless it's a logical impossibility. So I will not be able to prove that it is to every single possibility that there's no possible way objective morality can exist without God. What I will be able to show that is that every single attempt that's been made has failed. All right, every explanation we've come up with has failed. So let's look at this. Does God explain the existence of objective morality? All right. Let me ask you a question. Somebody, I'm going to regret this. Somebody describe me. Say a few things. Just what do you? I'm being very nice because I'm not going to pick any of you for fear of what you might say about each other. But I got a thick skin, so this is kind of a brainstorm. If you had to describe, say, my character, so some things that describe who I am. And my wife's in the room, which is what's terrifying me right now. All right, just words that describe who I am. Just start throwing some out.
Christian.
Christian. You can participate. My wife's holding her tongue. Surely there must be something positive you can say. And actually, I don't mind a few negative things. That's kind of part of the point.
Oh, negatives. Okay. You're stubborn.
I'm stubborn.
You're outgoing.
I'm outgoing. Informative. I like that better.
Well, you wanted some negatives.
Knowledgeable.
All right. These are all character traits or things that describe who I am.
I was going to start with loving, but you said you wanted negatives. So
Okay. The point is because I have, like we all do, I wanted to illustrate the fact that we all have some black marks on our character. All right. Now, just like you all have a character, we could do the same drill with everybody else in the class. We could start helping people describe words that describe who you are, what your character is. Well, guess what? We know that God is a person just like you're a person, which means God has a character just like you have a character. All right? Now, the difference is, whereas if you were to draw a circle that depicted my character, all right, this is my character. Right now, it's nice and white and pristine inside, but we know that's not really the case. In reality, there's little blotches all over it, right? Because I'm stubborn, as we've already established a little bit this morning.
Hey, I was.
If we were to look at any one of our
Some
characters,
people look at that as a sort of positive thing.
I got plenty of negatives though, believe me. If we were to look at any of our characters, that's what we would see. It would be, there'd be some white spots, but there'd be a lot of blotches all over there as well, probably more than I've even drawn on the board. If we were to look at God's character though, first of all, I can't even really do that. What I did is I drew a circle on the board because God is infinite in everything. All right, so there's no boundaries to his character. It's infinite like anything else. But for the purpose of this illustration, if I were to draw God's character, it's not going to have any blotches on it, is it? It's going to be perfectly white, pristine, because there's nothing wrong with God. God's perfect, as we've already established.
No vices.
No vices.
Yeah, but so we can't prove that.
Well, yes, we can. At least we can get very, very close.
You got to believe.
We've learned a lot about God that tends to point us in that direction already from the previous weeks, all right? For example, you've learned about a God who is a necessary being. In other words, remember God is infinite. This is getting to philosophy again. It's applying philosophy to what we learned in the cosmological argument. Remember we learned way back when that because God exists before time, that he's eternal. He never had a beginning point, all right? God is the only being in existence that does not depend upon someone or something else for his existence.
Right.
All right. In other words, nothing had to cause him. Nothing had to input this character into him. And that's part of what we mean by being perfect. Is that he is a necessary being. He must exist because there has to be a first cause to the universe. It must be out there. And yet he can't be caused by anything himself. That's getting further advanced into philosophy than I intended to go in the class, so I'm not going to go any further than that. But that was Ravi Zacharias. You can tell when we get into philosophy, Ravi Zacharias is probably one of the best Christian philosophers today. But that was his explanation to his one of his doctoral examination questions, which was asked him, "God is perfect, explain." as he told his wife, says, I think the only harder question that I could have been asked was define God and give 2 examples. But he went into the fact that God's the only necessary being. But for the purposes of our philosophical discussion today, I just want to point out that our character is marred, God's character is not. It's perfect. Now, look at 1 John, our one Bible verse we can talk about today, chapter 4, verse 8. And keep in mind, this is just me explaining why the Christian position shows that morality can come from God. That's just the first part of this premise. We've got to show that morality can come from God, and then talk about why nothing else works. 1 John chapter 4, verse 8.
Short letter.
It is a short letter. Chapter 4, verse 8. It's towards the end of the New Testament.
Whoever does not have love does not know God, because God is love.
Because God is love. So that tells us something about God's character, doesn't it? What one word does that tell us that we could use to help describe God's character?
Love.
Love, right? Now there's a whole bunch, I could go through a whole bunch of other Bible verses to describe other parts of God, of his character, but that's just an example. So we know that in this character is love. Now, is that love marred by anything? Are there any black marks in God's love? No, it is a perfect, pristine love. All right? Anything that is in God's character has to be perfect, because he's not marred by anything. All right? So, what we learn about this is when God is telling you to love your neighbor, what he's telling you to do is to model that part of his character. When you were made in God's image, that was also made part of your character. Now, we've messed it up. All right? Love inside us is marred by all these black marks. But there's still a seed there that was planted in every single one of your hearts at the time you were created, because you were created in God's image, which is why we can't get past the belief that there is an object of morality. No matter what type of brain games we try to play with ourselves, no matter what kind of lies we try to tell ourselves, when the chips are down and we're the ones being accused, we always come back to object and moral values exist. Why? Because there's a seed planted in each and every one of us, in our character, because it's based on God's character. Now, we're not nearly as perfect as God, but when God created us, remember the Bible says you're created in God's image. You're created in the image of God. That means that this character, in a very finite and imperfect sense, has been transferred over to you. That's why we have a conscience. All right? That tells us what's right and what's wrong. That's that little seed in God's character that's been transferred over to us, that's trying to communicate to us about what's right and what's wrong. So, what objective morality really is, what that higher standard is that we're all subject to, is God's character. That's where it comes from. It never began to exist because God never began to exist. It's always been there. God always has been love. All right? He's eternal. And so if we need to know, if we want to know whether something's right or something's wrong, then we appeal to God's character to determine whether it's right or whether it's wrong. That's where objective morality comes from. Now, as a practical matter, are we always going to be able to figure out the answer? What do you think?
No.
Why not? You're right. We will not always be able to figure out the proper moral answer. Why don't you think so?
Because we don't have all the information.
Yeah. Because remember, God's character is eternal. There are no boundaries to this character. We, as little finite little human beings, will never be able to fully understand all there is to know about God. All right? We can't, because He's infinite and we're not. All right? There's a lot more to God that can never fit inside of our brains. So we're never going to get a full, complete understanding of God's morality. But that doesn't excuse us from trying, and it doesn't mean that that law is not out there, that it doesn't exist above and beyond us.
It's not just that, but we don't have all the information when it comes to what's going on in the situation, a situation where we may be trying to choose what's morally right.
Right.
And a counter is temptation.
Explain.
Well, if we think we should be doing this, there's always the temptation that we can go in another direction, that draws us to another direction.
You'll get Satan against you.
Right, which is why the heart can be deceived. And while we have this internal conscience within us, we can never trust we can't just go based on feelings, which is why God gave us an objective textbook to tell us about his will and his character and what's right and wrong? The Bible. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that every single answer to every single moral dilemma is in here, okay? But it does at least give you some guiding principles, like God is love. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. We get some guiding principles to help us along the way. Now, so that explains that objective moral values can exist, or do exist if God exists, all right? The only thing I haven't explained yet is the word only. And in order to support the word only, I need to show that all these other attempts at creating some objective standard above us fail if God's not in the picture. Anybody ever heard of a gentleman by the name of Immanuel Kant?
Yes.
Leave that out there so we can see the argument. Kant, K-A-N-T, all right? Here's one attempt, and I'm just going to highlight a couple of the more famous attempts to arrive at an objective moral standard without God. Kant came up with something called the categorical imperative. I was a philosophy minor in college, so this just thrills me. I know it's probably boring you all to tears, but it thrills me to death. And I'm going to resist with every fiber of my being going into too much detail on this, because I know it can be boring for people who don't live and die by philosophy like I do. But Kant created something called the categorical imperative. Kant was a very rational guy. I liked Kant in college. I really did. Because Kant loved logic. All right? And that's my kind of guy. All right? I love logic. Now, what Kant said was, there's this categorical imperative, and what that means is it's a truth that we all have to accept to be true, even without explaining it. All right, we'll get to what it is in a second. But he says there's one truth that has to be true, even if without explanation, and from that one truth, you can logically arrive at a complete moral system. All right? So we don't need God, all we need is logic. Now, interestingly, Kant was a Christian. Kant did not want to remove God from the picture entirely. He did say that he was in awe. One thing he was always in awe of was the heavens, the starry host above, and the moral law within. He still thought that God had a hand in communicating this to us and creating everything. But his point was we can still reason it out without God, without God's help. We don't need the Bible, in other words. Now, a lot of atheistic philosophers have latched onto Kant, even though he was not an atheist, to say, well, if we can rationally arrive at a complete moral system without God, then we don't need God. All right? Then God is superfluous. All right? Now, the funny thing about Kant is even though he said it was a categorical imperative, singular, he came up with two ways of expressing it. And in his mind, somehow these are the same. I'll ask you after I tell you what they were if you think they're the same. I've yet to hear anybody adequately explain to me how these are really saying the same thing. But Kant thought they were saying the same thing. The first thing Kant said is you should only act in such a way that you can make it a universal law. In other words, moral laws can't be particular, situation specific. So you should only act in a way if you would allow everybody else to act in the same way. All right? The other way he phrased it was that you should always treat a person as an end, not as a means. All right? When you're interacting with other people, I don't use anybody. I don't use John as a means to accomplish some other end. John is an end in himself. I should always treat him with that respect. If I do something for you, John, or with you, it's for your benefit, not because I need you to arrive at something else to get something else. All right? Now, somehow, those are the same rule, according to Kant. I don't quite think they are, but that's what he thought. And he said, we all have to accept that, and once we accept that, then you can arrive at a complete moral system, logically speaking. But let me ask you a question.
They
Why?
both kind of sound like the golden rule.
Kind of. But why do we have to accept that? I mean, is that imperative, even if you think it is the same thing? Why is it categorical? Or why is it imperative? Other way, why is that category imperative? Why does it have to be accepted? I don't see any logical reason why we have to accept that. Keep in mind, take God out of the picture. According to Kant, God doesn't exist. Or, well, it doesn't need to exist in order to figure this out. But why do we have to accept it? I may personally accept those beliefs, but why do I have to? Without God in the picture. And I don't see any reason why we have to do that.
So you're talking about accept the moral part?
Accept his statement. For example, he says you should only act in such a way that everybody would act in the same way. That you can make a universal rule out of that. All right? Fine. Maybe I agree with that, but why should I have to agree with that? What Kant is saying is, logically speaking, you have to agree with that. Why? Why? I don't see why I should have to agree with that. Another one, real quick, and then we'll close, is John Stuart Mill. Not as many people have heard of him as has heard of Kant, but you've probably heard of his philosophy. Utilitarianism. You may not know what that means, but you've probably heard that name before. And what that means is basically you should take whatever action promotes the greatest good, or in an earlier version of it, the good for the greatest number of people. So if you got a choice between two moral issues, and one is going to help one person, one's going to help 10 people, you should do the one that's going to help 10 people. Sounds pretty good, right?
Sounds good.
Sounds good. All right, let me
Until
tell
they
this
take
philosophy.
your property.
Well, let me ask you this, all right?
Which is that one?
A murderer comes up to you and says, George, here's a gun. Hands you a gun. You can't just shoot the murderer yet because he's got a gun on you, okay? And he says, we have got 5 people standing against the wall. Either you choose one and shoot and murder one of them yourself, or I'm going to shoot all 5. Does that make it your moral responsibility or morally right or moral duty for you to commit murder? It's a hard question, all right? Thou shalt not kill, all right? And that's the thing, that utilitarianism puts us into that scenario where they would say, yes, you should murder that one person
To save the other 4.
to save the other 4, all right?
I have an example. I was watching History Channel or whatever, and they brought out a point where the English discovered Germany's secret code message.
Mm-hmm.
And Germans felt confident that nobody was going to break that code.
When was this in history? During the World War II?
Yeah,
Okay.
Second World War.
Okay.
And a situation occurred where they knew that Germany was going to bomb a certain community in England.
Mm-hmm.
And they couldn't do anything about it because they knew if they could have stopped that bombing, but if they stopped the bombing, they would have given away the fact that they decoded their secret messages.
Mm-hmm.
And they wanted to use those further down eventually Normandy or D-Day. But they had to allow the bombing of one of their communities, and hundreds of people got killed, and yet they knew it was going to happen.
And see, that gets into more complicated moral issues. That's why specifically the example that I gave you required you to take the affirmative action. It was you to actually do the killing, not just allow the killing to happen. But yeah, I mean, that gets into all sorts of situations. And I'm not going to go into more details, but there are other scenarios I could give you. And the point is, no matter which attempt we look at, inevitably it seems that it doesn't give us a full picture of morality. It doesn't satisfactorily give us a full, complete moral system unless God is in the picture. In closing, I want to give you one example from, surprise, surprise, Ravi Zacharias, and then we'll wrap things up based on all of this conversation. And that is, a student walked up to him and said, Dr. Zacharias, I cannot believe in God when there is so much evil in the world. And Ravi Zacharias used a lot of the principles we've talked about here today to illustrate one answer to that question. That's probably the leading reason why a lot of people don't believe in God, to be honest with you. And he said, wait a minute, so you believe there's such a thing as evil? Your question assumes that there's such a thing as evil. And you said, I can't believe in God when there's so much evil in the world. And the student said, yeah, I guess I'm believing there's such a thing as evil. Well, if you believe there's such a thing as evil, doesn't that also mean there must be such a thing as good? By which because of the opposite of evil is good. And he said, yes, I have to concede that by saying there's evil, there's such a thing as good. Well, if there's such a thing as good, aren't you implying that there's a moral law by which to judge the difference between good and evil? And the student said, yes, I have to concede that there is a moral law that to judge the difference between good and evil. Okay, that's premise number 2 right there. He just got him to concede. Well, but if there's a moral law, there has to be a moral law giver in order for that moral law to exist, and that's who you're trying to disprove, not prove by your question. And that's what we were just talking about, the fact that God must exist. The student stopped for a second, looked at him, and this is according to Ravi Zacharias, is no kidding. He says, "So what then am I asking you?" was the student's response. He completely lost track of his own question. And that's how, it's not, this type of reasoning doesn't just show us that God exists, it also gives us an answer, at least one answer, to the existence of evil and suffering in the world, if only to show that by even assuming evil exists, you also have to assume that God exists. It logically follows.